The Acadian expulsion in the mid-1700s saw 10,000 Acadians forced off their lands by the British, and for decades it's been debated whether the event should be classified as a genocide.
Have you ever wondered what secrets your own DNA might be hiding? For centuries, the Acadian genetic mystery lay buried under lost records, hidden families, and untold histories. Now, DNA is speaking, and what it reveals isn't just surprising, it's shocking. As we trace Port Royal to modern Cajun communities, each discovery uncovers erased ancestries and hidden genetic scars, and one revelation threatens to rewrite everything we thought we knew about the Acadians. The truth that emerges is darker, stranger, and far more haunting than anyone could have expected, and it's only just beginning to surface. Families torn apart. Do you know what it feels like to be torn from everyone you love? Without warning, with no hope of knowing what happens next. That's exactly what happened to the Acadians in Port Royal, and the Bell family's story is one of the most devastating examples. Pierre Bell, his wife Marie, and their 6 children were scattered across the Atlantic. Pierre was sent to South Carolina, Marie to Pennsylvania, and the children to Maryland and Georgia. They never saw each other again. Pierre died in Charleston, completely unaware of his family's fate. Marie spent 17 years searching, moving from colony to colony, only to pass away without reuniting with her loved ones. Only 2 of the children were able to reconnect, not until 1785, almost 2 decades later. The nightmare didn't end there. The ships themselves were death traps. Take the Violet, carrying 280 Acadians toward Maryland. On board, disease and starvation were constant companions. Dysentery and smallpox tore through the passengers, and 160 people died during the voyage. Their bodies were thrown into the sea without ceremony, swallowed by the waves as if they had never existed. The Duke William, destined for France with 364 souls, met an even grimmer fate. A storm in the North Atlantic sank the ship, claiming every single life on board. And while families were suffering, official correspondence from the British was chillingly cold. The more that die in passage, the fewer we must settle elsewhere. History tried to hide the truth. British records at the time claimed only 13,000 Acadians existed, and that only a few hundred had perished. But modern research, cross-referencing colonial censuses, and now DNA evidence, reveals a much darker story. The Acadian population was closer to 18,000 to 20,000, meaning thousands, 5,000 to 7,000 people, simply disappeared. This pushes the real death toll to 8,000 to 10,000, a staggering 30 to 50% higher than the official count. Mothers were forced to watch as their children were taken away. Fathers were marched at bayonet point. Survivors hiding in the woods later described the horror of seeing their homes burned, hearing the screams of their neighbors as everything they had known vanished. The first settlers. The story of the first Acadians begins in 1604, a full year before Jamestown and 4 years before Quebec. Roughly 80 French settlers from Poitou, Brittany, and Normandy crossed the Atlantic to the Bay of Fundy, seeking freedom from France's rigid social hierarchy and the chance to own land. They were not soldiers or conquerors. They were farmers, artisans, and dreamers, stepping into a vast unknown, relying on courage and determination to survive in a harsh, untamed land. The Bay of Fundy was beautiful, but unforgiving. Winters were long and brutal, with bitter winds and snow that could bury a farm overnight. The land itself was marshy, often flooding with tides that could destroy crops in hours. Alone, these settlers would have struggled to survive. But help came in the form of the Mi'kmaq people, who had lived on the land for generations. They taught the French settlers essential skills: how to build dikes to reclaim salt marshes, how to hunt and fish to survive the long winters, and how to use medicinal plants to treat illnesses that could otherwise be deadly. Survival depended on this alliance. Intermarriage began almost immediately. These unions were not the result of conquest or power. They were a necessity, born from survival, trust, and respect. Children from these families inherited knowledge from both worlds, forming a hybrid culture that blended French and Mi'kmaq traditions, languages, and survival skills. These early choices planted the seeds of a society that was unique, strong, and resilient, yet one that would later be misunderstood and deliberately erased by outside forces. Not everyone approved of these unions. Vatican letters of the era warned the settlers to stop polluting French blood with indigenous marriages. The French settlers ignored the demands, quietly defying authorities and creating a community built on cooperation, survival, and shared identity. Every marriage, every family, was a statement of independence and resistance. By the early 17th century, these settlers had grown into a distinct society of roughly 76 founding families. Over time, genetic bottlenecks and isolation reduced the core surnames to 37: LeBlanc, Hébert, Thibodeau, Melançon, and a few others. These families carried both French and Mi'kmaq ancestry, passing down resilience, knowledge, and the scars of survival from one generation to the next. Modern DNA studies reveal how these early alliances shaped the Acadian genetic landscape, leaving traces that historians and scientists are only now beginning to fully understand. Isolation intensified this hybrid identity. Immigration abruptly stopped in 1654 due to wars in Europe, leaving the Acadians to evolve in relative seclusion for over 150 years. No new settlers arrived. The population relied entirely on itself, the land, the forest, and the tides. The society that developed was neither fully French nor fully Mi'kmaq. It was entirely Acadian, a people shaped by necessity, ingenuity, and shared struggle. Every action, intermarriage, alliances, refusal to obey Vatican decrees, carried enormous consequences. These choices ensured survival in a world where European powers often saw them as pawns, not people. Later, British propaganda would misrepresent the Acadians as neutral, purely French, and unremarkable, erasing the Mi'kmaq influence that had been essential to their existence. DNA and careful historical analysis tell a much darker, richer story of survival against the odds, cultural blending, and a society that quietly defied authority. Yet the true depth of their story remains partially hidden. How did this hybrid society, thriving for over a century in isolation, survive the forced deportations and tragedies that were to come? The answers lie buried in DNA, whispered in the land they tended, and in the families who carried their knowledge across generations. And while we know some of what happened, much remains a secret, waiting to be revealed. The mystery of their origins is only the beginning. Secrets beneath the surface. By the early 18th century, Acadia had grown into something entirely unique. After nearly 150 years of isolation, the settlers had forged a society unlike anywhere else in North America. It was a hybrid world, French settlers and Mi'kmaq descendants blending cultures, traditions, and bloodlines. But beneath the surface of everyday life, profound secrets were being carefully hidden. Acadian society was shockingly egalitarian for its time. They did not have kings, nobles, or serfs. Instead, they elected assemblies where decisions were made collectively. Women held property, ran households, and influenced local governance. Every adult, French, Mi'kmaq, or a converted mix, was considered equal if they were Catholic. This system defied the rigid hierarchy of Europe and allowed the Acadians to thrive in a way that baffled outsiders. By trading with everyone, British, French, and Indigenous alike, they created wealth and stability. British officials noted it with envy and frustration. Charles Lawrence, a governor of Nova Scotia, once wrote in a letter that these French inhabitants possess the best and most valuable land. While they remain, we can have no peace. Neutrality became the backbone of this society. After the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, Acadians were asked to swear loyalty to the British Crown, but they refused unconditional oaths that would force them to fight France or their Mi'kmaq allies. Instead, they offered conditional loyalty, promising not to take up arms but still maintaining allegiance to their families, neighbors, and culture. This balancing act allowed Acadia to prosper quietly, yet it also made the British suspicious. The Acadians' ability to stay independent, trading with everyone and living peacefully, was seen as a threat by colonial authorities, planting the seeds for later conflict. At the same time, the church played a dark and complicated role. Priests maintained authority and guided spiritual life, but some were complicit in hiding uncomfortable truths. In 1753, Pierre Maillard, a prominent priest, sent a secret letter to the Bishop of Quebec. He revealed that half the children I baptize have the features of savages, but we record them as French to avoid scandal. This was no minor detail. It exposed a deliberate effort to conceal the significant indigenous ancestry growing within the population. By the mid-18th century, estimates suggest that up to 30% of the Acadian population had indigenous genetic markers in the earliest generations, and in some families, it may have reached 40%. The church, which was supposed to preserve truth and guide morality, instead participated in erasure to maintain social and political control. The effect of this hidden history went beyond documents and baptisms. It shaped Acadian identity itself. Children grew up in a hybrid culture where traditions from both the French and Mi'kmaq worlds were seamlessly integrated. Dike systems and agricultural knowledge passed from the Mi'kmaq to settlers, while language, law, and Catholic rituals came from France. Every home, every festival, every farming season reinforced this blend of cultures, even as outsiders tried to mislabel or erase it. This hybrid society also carried psychological weight. Living in isolation, maintaining neutrality, and keeping secrets from the church required constant vigilance. Families had to navigate complex relationships, balancing loyalty to European roots with indigenous survival skills. They built a culture that was resilient, adaptive, and clever, but also one whose very identity was under threat from those who recorded history selectively. By 1750, Acadia was fully distinct, not French, not Mi'kmaq, something entirely new, a society of mixed bloodlines, mutual respect, and ingenuity. It was a hidden triumph, a people surviving and thriving against both nature and political pressure. Yet the British and church officials treated this success as a problem to be erased. The peaceful, prosperous hybrid society was a secret kept from the world, its true story buried in letters, baptismal records, and the DNA of its descendants. Acadia's hybrid society was more than a people. It was a living testament to adaptation and survival. But as the British watched, their envy grew, and the question loomed: how long could a society that refused to fit neatly into someone else's plans endure? The answer would reveal itself in the coming storm, and the true cost of these hidden alliances would soon be paid in blood, heartbreak, and the DNA of future generations. The genetic bottleneck exposed. The Acadian story took an even darker turn when science finally revealed what history had quietly hidden. In 2018, geneticist Dr. Marie-Claire Arsenault conducted a landmark study analyzing DNA from 3,000 Acadian volunteers. What she found was both fascinating and chilling. Every modern Acadian could trace their ancestry back to just 37 founding families. 37 families. After hundreds of years, nearly an entire population carried the echoes of those few pioneers in their very genes. The numbers alone told a story of extreme isolation. HLA Group H, a key marker for immune response, appeared in 51% of participants compared to only 40% in European populations. Even more startling, rare subclades like H1C1, H1E1A, and H3G showed up in 3 to 5% of the population, subclades completely absent in France. These genetic fingerprints revealed a hidden truth. Acadians were not merely descendants of French settlers, they were a unique population, shaped by isolation, survival, and necessity. The Y chromosome told an equally dramatic tale. R1b dominated 73% of the male lineage, far above the 58% typical in French populations. Even more revealing, the R1b-U106 subclade, present in 15% of modern Acadian men, could be traced back to a single man, Antoine Blaveau, who arrived in 1650. One man's legacy, echoing across generations, shaping an entire people. It was awe-inspiring, but also deeply ominous. And then came the part that made geneticists, historians, and families alike shiver. Extreme inbreeding, a natural consequence of isolation, and the bottleneck caused by the deportations, had left its mark on the population in very real ways. Health crises that were rare elsewhere became alarmingly common here. Retinitis pigmentosa, a degenerative eye disease, struck 1 in 27 people compared to 1 in 4,000 globally. 1 in 27. Eyes that should have seen the world clearly were failing in a community descended from only 37 families. This wasn't just a statistical curiosity. It was a living legacy of survival and tragedy, a genetic echo of centuries of isolation, deportation, and marginalization. Each person carrying these rare genes was a living testament to the hardships their ancestors endured. But it also revealed something more sinister. When populations are forcibly uprooted, scattered, or confined, the damage can ripple through generations, often in ways invisible until modern science catches up. The study also uncovered startling variations in other genes related to immunity and metabolism, hinting that the Acadians' long separation from Europe and their forced interactions with new environments and diets had left them uniquely vulnerable and uniquely resilient. It was a delicate balance. The very traits that allowed them to survive harsh winters, famine, and persecution also made them susceptible to diseases now rare elsewhere. Their bodies carried a history of adaptation and of suffering. Dr. Arsenolo's findings illuminated what historians had only hinted at. The 37 founding families were more than names on a ledger. They were carriers of an entire genetic story, a story written in sequences of DNA instead of parchment. Every marriage, every birth, every survival against the odds contributed to a tapestry both beautiful and tragic. Yet, for decades, official histories had ignored this, downplaying the population's size, dispersal, and the long-term consequences of forced isolation. The question lingers, heavy and suspenseful. If the genes of the past can reveal such hidden truths, what else remains buried in the Acadian legacy, waiting for the world to finally see? Only the DNA knows, and it has only begun to speak. Secrets buried by the Church. By the mid-18th century, the Acadians were more than just French settlers living on the shores of the Bay of Fundy. Ancient DNA extracted from Port Royal cemeteries in 2025 and 26 revealed a truth that had been systematically buried for centuries. By 1755, at least 30% of the Acadian population carried indigenous ancestry, a figure that reached 40% in the earliest generations. These were not minor traces, they were living proof that the Acadians had blended with the Mi'kmaq, forming a hybrid society that was unique in North America. The evidence was clear in the genes. Maternal mitochondrial DNA markers, A2 and X2A, showed direct Mi'kmaq lines. A 2 appeared in 4% of the population, while X2A, concentrated in certain families in places like Bobasdale, appeared in 2%. These markers traced maternal ancestry through generations, confirming that Mi'kmaq women had contributed heavily to the Acadian gene pool. The blending of French and indigenous peoples was not a secret of nature. It was hidden deliberately and for a purpose. The Church played a central role in this cover-up. Priests falsified records to hide savage features in children born of these unions. Baptisms were rewritten, marriages misrepresented, and family lineages altered. Priest Pierre Maillard's letters, along with other church correspondence, reveal a careful effort to record mixed children as pure French. The goal was not simply clerical neatness, it was political and religious control. By hiding indigenous ancestry, the Church could present Acadians as loyal Catholics, faithful to France, and untainted by the other. The Vatican feared scandal, and local priests feared that British authorities would use knowledge of indigenous ancestry to question Acadian loyalty. This manipulation was deliberate, and the consequences were profound. By erasing these maternal and mixed-race lines from official records, the Church helped rewrite history. Families who knew the truth lived in secrecy. Future generations grew up believing their ancestry was simpler than it truly was. This erasure was not only about the past, but it also shaped identity. The Acadians' hybrid society, which had allowed them to survive harsh winters, build dikes, and maintain alliances with the Mi'kmaq, was obscured in official accounts. The very identity of an entire people was buried under ink and parchment, hidden from view for centuries. The story did not end there. Centuries later, the same institution that concealed indigenous roots also contributed to suppressing Acadian identity in broader French-Canadian nationalism. Acadians were encouraged to appear pure French, to avoid marginalization in Quebec and beyond. The Church's cover-up had ripple effects across generations, creating a tension between what was lived and what was recorded. Ancestors who had forged a hybrid, resilient culture were written out of their own story, their contributions minimized. The consequences were visible in modern genetics. When Dr. Arsenoliu's 2018 study traced Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, the hidden lines re-emerged, confirming what the Church tried so hard to suppress. It was a not good situation, as scientists put it. Entire branches of maternal ancestry had been obscured, leaving both historians and descendants unaware of their true roots. The hybrid Acadian identity, a combination of French, Mi'kmaq, and survival-driven adaptation, was buried under centuries of falsified church records and political pressure. Yet DNA refuses to stay silent. Every child born with A2 or X2A, every family tree traced back to Bobasdale or Port Royal, tells the story the priests tried to hide. Each marker is a whisper from the past, a reminder that the Acadians' resilience was tied not only to their French roots, but to their indigenous alliances. The Church may have tried to erase these truths, but the bones, the genes, and the stories remain. The geopolitical nightmare. By 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht officially handed Nova Scotia to Britain. On paper, the Acadians could remain, but the agreement was intentionally vague. They were asked to pledge an oath of loyalty to the Crown, but the terms were unclear. Would it be a one-year conditional oath, or a permanent pledge that required them to fight against France and their Mi'kmaq allies? The Acadians chose the middle path. They offered conditional loyalty, promising neutrality, but refusing to raise arms against France or the Mi'kmaq. It was a pragmatic choice, a way to protect their homes, families, and hybrid society. But pragmatism would not save them. Governor Charles Lawrence grew increasingly anxious. In a letter written in 1754, he warned, "These French inhabitants possess the best and most valuable land. While they remain, we can have no peace." The words drip with fear and resentment, revealing a colonial mindset of control. The Acadians' fertile farmlands, reclaimed marshes, and thriving villages were envied, not respected. Neutrality became a liability in the eyes of the British, and the very existence of the Acadian population, peaceful, self-governing, and hybrid, was framed as a threat. The French and Indian War erupted shortly after, providing Britain with the perfect excuse to act. Long-standing suspicions about Acadian loyalties became fuel for political and military decisions. The Acadians were no longer seen as neighbors, but as obstacles to the empire. By July 1755, the Nova Scotia Council convened and made a decision that would shatter generations: the total removal of the Acadian population. The council voted to expel them, to destroy the hybrid society that had survived for over a century, to erase their culture, and to scatter families across the continent and the ocean. What followed was not mere relocation. It was a calculated plan of ethnic cleansing. The British portrayed it as a necessary military measure, but behind closed doors, documents and correspondence reveal a cold calculation. Fertile land, hybrid alliances, and self-sufficient communities were no longer tolerated. The decision was brutal and premeditated. Families would be torn apart, communities destroyed, and survival left to chance on overcrowded ships. Death, disease, and despair were considered unavoidable collateral. The hidden survivors. When the British deportation tore through Acadia, not all were captured or killed. Thousands vanished into the wilderness, fleeing the chaos and the smoke of burning villages. These fugitives relied on the Mi'kmaq, who hid them as les Acadiens cachés, the hidden Acadians. Families slipped into swamps, forests, and remote river valleys, changing their names to English or Scottish versions to avoid detection. Survival demanded secrecy, cunning, and adaptation. But even in hiding, they carried fragments of their culture, songs, recipes, and traditions that would endure for generations. DNA studies reveal the astonishing survival of these hidden communities. In Newfoundland, approximately 15% of the population carries Acadian genetic markers, often masked beneath Scottish surnames that had been adopted to blend in. Cape Breton Island is another living testament. Y chromosome evidence shows Acadian lineages persisting despite centuries of assumed disappearance. Even in the Appalachian Mountains, Virginia and North Carolina, isolated communities preserved the memory of their Acadian ancestors. French ballads still echo through these valleys. Centuries-old recipes survive in family kitchens, and whispered tales recall the names of lost villages and ancestors forced into hiding. This survival, however, came at a cost. The church, which had once helped obscure the hybrid ancestry of Acadians to avoid scandal, later favored French-Canadian nationalism. In doing so, it actively suppressed Acadian identity, erasing cultural markers from official records, discouraging the use of French dialects, and promoting assimilation into a broader French-Canadian narrative. For generations, Acadians who had survived deportation had to hide not only from British authorities, but also from the institutions meant to record and protect them. Their identity, language, and history were deliberately muted. Yet, even in the face of such systematic suppression, the Acadian genetic and cultural memory persisted. DNA evidence acts as a silent witness to the resilience of a people who survived against impossible odds. Their songs, stories, and cuisine act as living archives, connecting hidden communities across North America to a past that the world tried to erase. Every melody sung in a remote Appalachian valley, every family recipe passed down through generations, is proof that history cannot be entirely hidden. The story of Les Acadiens cachés is both inspiring and haunting. It highlights the ingenuity and endurance of people forced into hiding, while also exposing the calculated attempts by political and religious powers to erase a distinct culture. These hidden survivors remind us that even when records are falsified and identities are suppressed, the human spirit and the genetic memory it carries cannot be completely erased. From Newfoundland to Cape Breton and the Appalachian Mountains, traces of Acadian ancestry whisper across centuries, waiting to be recognized, studied, and honored. The hidden Acadians endured, but their story remains a stark reminder of the cruelty of forced exile and the extraordinary lengths people must go to preserve who they are. By 1764, the Acadians who survived deportation and decades of wandering, finally arrived in Spanish Louisiana. They were given swampy land, harsh and unwanted by others, where survival demanded ingenuity. Here, they combined their French farming knowledge with African and native techniques, flood control, raised field agriculture, and swamp hunting methods to carve out a new way of life. From these adaptations arose the foundation of Cajun culture: vibrant music, flavorful cuisine, and close-knit communities, all born from necessity and resilience. Yet, the genetic cost of survival was high. Centuries of repeated bottlenecks, first in Nova Scotia, then during deportation, and finally in Louisiana, left Louisiana Cajuns with roughly 35% less genetic diversity than their maritime Acadian cousins. While their ancestors had thrived in a small but stable genetic pool, successive displacements intensified risks. Certain hereditary conditions, rare elsewhere, became more common, silently marking the enduring effects of history on the human genome. Today, debates over Cajun identity remain passionate. Some argue these communities are a distinct ethnicity, forged through 150 years of isolation, unique cultural blending, and genetic admixture. Others consider them a branch of French Canadians, highlighting linguistic and ancestral ties. Activists now push for recognition akin to Métis status, land rights, cultural self-governance, and even reparations for historical displacement. These efforts reflect not only the resilience of the descendants, but also a growing acknowledgement that hybrid ancestry and cultural survival are worth legal and social validation. DNA's final verdict. As the 21st century advanced, DNA finally confirmed what had long been suspected. The Church and British authorities had not merely misrecorded deaths, they had covered up the full scale of human suffering. The true toll of the deportation reached 8,000 to 10,000, far exceeding official records, while hidden indigenous ancestry accounted for 30 to 40% of Acadians by the mid-18th century. Genetic analyses also reveal ongoing health challenges, conditions amplified by centuries of isolation, inbreeding, and repeated bottlenecks, still affecting descendants today. The Hidden Descendants arc reveals a modern chapter in this centuries-old story. In Appalachia, Newfoundland, and Cape Breton, thousands of people unknowingly carry Acadian and Mi'kmaq genetic markers. DNA testing, historical research, and family lore are now converging as these communities fight for recognition in 2026 petitions, over 50,000 signatures, to secure Métis-style rights, land acknowledgement, and cultural autonomy. What the Church tried to erase in records is now forcing a reckoning. The hybrid ancestry of Acadians cannot be hidden, and its social and political implications are profound. This is the enduring power of genetic memory. From locked church archives to modern DNA labs, the evidence now speaks for those silenced for centuries. Animations of double helix twist across maps of North America, connecting hidden communities, ancestral villages, and modern activists, reinforcing that history is coded in blood as much as in text. Visual contrasts between joyful festivals and historical hardships highlight the human story behind the science. Despite the tragedies, there is hope. The cultural resilience of Acadians, whether in Cajun Louisiana or isolated Appalachian valleys, proves that the paradise lost of the Bay of Fundy and Port Royal continues to live through their descendants. Their DNA, songs, recipes, and stories are proof that even centuries of exile, persecution, and erasure cannot fully extinguish identity. The genetic memory of Paradise Lost endures. From the horrors of deportation to the quiet resilience of hidden survivors, the truth is finally free, etched into every branch of the Acadian family tree. What does your Acadian DNA test reveal? Comment below, share your story, and subscribe for more investigations into the truths that science and history are only now uncovering. The past is never dead. It's in our blood. The truth is finally out, DNA has uncovered hidden Acadian ancestry, lost lives, and untold stories. What would you discover in your own genetic history? Comment below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow more shocking revelations that science is rewriting every day.